Hello, I'm Erinch, as Christy introduced, and I've spent most of the last 5 years trying to get large businesses to change the way that they buy their commodities and try to influence the power that they exert over their suppliers to address the kind of issues that Stefan and the way people are treated in their supply chains. So for us, this was a little bit of I guess like a red rag to a bull, to notice that, wait a minute, and they were investors. And there were people who, in some instances, and many instances it turned out, shared the values that we were trying to promote. So we decided we're going to try to influence these 10 companies, and we selected 7 issues to focus on, one of which was gender. The process for us was very much one where we looked at how change happens, what influences companies, what influences business behavior, and we saw a little bit of a cycle. And that cycle was that we retain a critical friend approach throughout, but we start building through. We've moved into public campaigning, and what was critical for us was to emphasize back to consumers and supporters who exerted their own overlap with gender and climate change. And all along, for us, it was critical to engage consumers, a real mixture of those two that started getting the ball moving. And what underpins the campaign, as Stephanie alluded to, is this scorecard that all throughout we've been tracking. So we were updating this on a biannual basis, and underpinning all these numbers are 300 plus indicators that were developed through engaging the industry, through engaging the businesses themselves, as well as investors and others in this space. And they measure a range of issues around the extent to which the companies understand that particular issue, the extent to which they're committed to addressing it, and how are they communicating to their suppliers. And it was all done based on publicly available information. Our position was, if you are doing something transformative, something impressive on this issue, there's never a reason to keep it a secret. It's actually much more powerful if we get it out into the open domain, and we started triggering a little bit of a race to the top on these issues. And what we saw were huge score jumps, particularly on the 2 issues that were most neglected at the beginning of the campaign, gender and land. And on both of those, we saw some significant movement. And this is my last slide, and we've sort of tried to capture what's happened specifically to gender, which was one of the areas that was most neglected. The green bars show what the scores were at the beginning. Coca-Cola was the most advanced in terms of their understanding, their emphasis on women's empowerment in their supply chains, and most of the other companies did very little. By the end, we saw some significant improvements in awareness, in understanding which roles women play, but also some very specific commitments to the way that they ask their suppliers to move. So I'll end with that, and just to sort of repeat, I mean, the changes will take a while for them to filter down into real action, some of which has already happened, some of which we continue to monitor to happen. But change is possible. Large companies listen to consumers and their investors, and particularly if those two are speaking in unison, then it's a very difficult voice to ignore. Thanks very much.